Welcome to Dax Machina. Join us as we explore the mysteries of this world. Cryptids, monsters, macabre tales, and horror stories abound. Could they be true? Are monsters real? Follow us down this dark pathway, and we'll find out together.
Good evening, folks, and thank you for joining us on another edition of Dax Machina. Joining us tonight is my co-host Anthony, Doc, and Steve, and we have a very special guest tonight, a man that needs no introduction in this field. Dr. Jeff Meldrum has joined us tonight, and we are thrilled to have him, and we're going to jump right in. And Doc, if you'll give us a little bit of your background and story, and then we'll jump in from there.
Sure. Well, I am by profession and training an anatomical scientist with an emphasis in physical anthropology, and that simply means I teach human gross anatomy in the health professions programs here at Idaho State University, and I conduct research in the field of physical anthropology. Especially, my interests focus on the evolution, the pattern and process of the emergence of adaptations associated with walking on two legs, or bipedalism. So that's what sort of predisposed me, sort of set me up to intersect with this very fascinating question of the possibility of another bipedal primate out there. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest as a youngster. I was first exposed to the notion of Bigfoot when Roger Patterson actually came to town. I was living in Spokane, Washington, and he came to town to present his documentary that showcased that notorious 60-second film clip that was captured on the sandbar of Bluff Creek in 1967. And I'm not sure if it was the first, but it was one of the first showings in the United States, commercial showings, public showings, that is, after it had been viewed by a panel of scientists both at the University of British Columbia and then also at the Smithsonian here in the United States. And that made a huge impression on an 11-year-old mind, and really sort of crystallized so many interests that were already fomenting and brewing at that time in my life. My interests in natural history and zoology and human evolution and mysteries of all types. I was always attracted to that edge, that fringe, that frontier of knowledge. And so this, the image of Patty on the screen really embodied all of that in a very dramatic and impactful way. And so, that interest waxed and waned over the years, but eventually I found myself in a position to pursue those interests professionally as a scholar, as a university professor. And it opened up all kinds of opportunities for me to investigate this in a way that aren't afforded to everyone. And it's been an amazing ride. The last 26 years now that I've been actively involved in the pursuit of this subject. So it's a fascinating question. It's in many ways aspects are largely resolved in my mind, but obviously still inconclusive. We still come up just short of that ultimate convincing demonstration of the existence of an unrecognized species, but the evidence continues to mount.
Definitely. One of the things that I always found interesting is your description of what you refer to as the mid-tarsal break.
Right.
Can you describe that a little bit more for us?
Well, sure. Having grown up reading Ivan Sanderson's, John Green's books, Grover Krantz and so forth, I was, and with that interest in the tracks and the trackways, the footprint evidence, and how that related to our history as a species, our adaptations for walking on two legs. I was familiar with a lot of that footprint evidence as it was portrayed, and so when I had the chance to see some tracks firsthand, fresh in the ground, there were features. In addition to all of the signs of animation, of spontaneity, the freshness of these tracks, there were some examples in particular that showed a very distinctive pressure ridge, a mid-tarsal pressure ridge, like a speed bump across the track. There were also some examples of half tracks, not the abbreviated footprint you would see if a human were to sprint on their toes, say down the beach in the wet sand, but rather the front half of the foot, that part of the foot that and footprint rather that would appear ahead of that speed bump. And this related to running. I mean, it was clear that these were running tracks because the stride length was nearly double the walking step and stride length. And so when I saw these examples, I mean, immediately that image that isn't widely known or appreciated. I mean, even if people have seen it, they have most people had now, as a result of my preoccupation with it, most people have no idea about what the significance of that pressure ridge was. And that was a photo of a footprint and the resulting cast from the Patterson-Gimlin film site that was the footprint was photographed by Lyle Laverty, and the cast was made by Bob Titmus. Neither very widely, like I said, very widely publicized, and certainly not appreciated. But the connection in my mind was immediate on seeing these tracks in southeastern Washington in 1996 that bore a remarkable resemblance to that. So what does that mean? I mean, what's the significance? Is it just an artifact? Is it me over-interpreting just a simple feature? Well, no, it's a very fundamental aspect of the way in which hominoids walk. And not to wax too technical, but I mean it's important. I mean, it bears discussion because it demonstrates that this evidence bears up to this scrutiny, and to those who have the wherewithal and appreciate it, it's amazing. But the fundamental adaptation is a grass climbing adaptation. The foot more resembles a hand with that big divergent big toe that is so thumb-like in order to go up vertical supports, inclined tree trunks and branches. And in order to do that effectively, the foot has adapted to a much greater degree of flexibility through the instep. Well, they don't have an instep because they don't have an arch, but through that midfoot, rather, what we would look at our foot and see the instep. And we have those same joints. It's just that the joints have become much more limited in their range of motion, so that the foot can screw into a rather stable platform. But the Sasquatch foot, as did the early hominins that first tottered on 2 feet instead of 4, they retained that mobility, and the Sasquatch is quite advantageous even with the loss of the divergent big toe, because it allows for much greater flexibility of the foot to navigate the very broken terrain and tolerate the huge stresses imposed by their massive body weight than what humans are adapted to. I mean, we're essentially flatlanders. We've evolved for endurance walking and running over the flatlands, over the plains. And so the foot has become a stable platform with this arch that increases the efficiency of the leverage of the plantar flexors of the ankle used in running and walking. So it's a really significant, it's interesting, like I said, how some people don't have the wherewithal to appreciate it. Some people take pot shots at it that I'm just blowing smoke, that I don't know what I'm talking about. But it's gained remarkably over the past decade and a half now. It has, in fact, gained a lot of traction in mainstream academia. I've pointed out time and time again the Laetoli hominin footprints in East Africa, the first compelling evidence of bipedalism preserved in this volcanic ashfall, show examples of mid-tarsal pressure ridge. And that correlates with the skeletal remains, the foot skeleton, that indicates a much greater degree of mobility of the midfoot that would functionally be correlated with that artifact of the footprints. And we see that persisting for literally millions of years. The arch didn't emerge in our lineage until our species. It was refined. There's evidence of it. I mean, it wasn't just an all or none. It wasn't a flip of the switch. There was a mosaic. There were gradations of stabilization of different parts of the foot and so on through that lineage. And by the time we get to our immediate ancestor, the common ancestor shared between us and Neanderthals, the foot had largely stabilized. The arch was still low. The heel was still elongated somewhat, and toes a little bit longer in proportion than ours. All features that are present in the Sasquatch foot, but more greatly amplified. But that's finally starting to be acknowledged and to be caught on, although they don't cite me because of my association with the Sasquatch topic. I'm persona. I'm the kook off on the sidelines, and so even though I've been saying this and publishing on it for 10 years, those papers don't get cited. I don't get acknowledged for drawing attention to what now is becoming conventional wisdom. But it's still gratifying to see that validation of that initial interpretation of those artifacts, and the fact that what I was describing for the Sasquatch adaptive morphology of the foot, which was taken as being weird, as being illogical. Now that's the norm. That's the way early hominins walked on feet, just like what I proposed for the Sasquatch 20 years ago.
Yeah. I wanted to point out we had a super chat from William Bedard. He says, "Dr. Meldrum, great to see you. This channel is all about truth. Welcome to the channel." And we're actually starting to pick up some questions from the audience. Can you still hear me? Oh, it froze up. Oh, anybody else? Anybody else hear me? Am I the one that froze up?
No, I could hear you, DA. From my vantage point, Dr. Meldrum is the only one that's frozen.
And that happened once before earlier. Hopefully we can get this straightened out. Wanted to thank William Bedard for the super chat. There he is. Now we can't hear you. Mm-mm. Well, he'll be right back. There we go. Still can't hear you. What the heck? Folks, we'll get to the questions here shortly. Hopefully, we get this straightened right out.
Yeah, it's like DA. It's the Steve is frozen and Doc is frozen, and so is Dr. Meldrum. You can't hear me?
I can hear you, but I can't hear Dr. Meldrum.
Oh no, I can. Yeah, now Steve's unfrozen. I think it's the restream. I do. Because none but problems with it. I don't know why, but brother, I don't. It's like when we were on early, it was working fine.
How about now? That any better?
All right.
Okay. I just jumped off.
Here we go.
We had a couple of questions that was in the chat for you. Sal
Sure.
Paso says, "Does this mobility give them the ability to climb easier?"
Well, certainly climb mountainsides and irregular terrain on very steep slopes and extreme topography, certainly they're not going to be climbing trees as easily as a great ape without that divergent big toe, just as we are limited. But then again, we still climb trees pretty well, especially the trees that we find in the forests that we are familiar with here, particularly in the West, but also, I mean, the hardwood forest, in the East as well. A Sasquatch, because of that mid-tarsal break, doesn't walk the same way we do. We have experienced shortening of the toes to reduce bending stresses, because when we toe off off of that arch, the arch concentrates plantar pressure under the very forepart of the forefoot, under the heads of the metatarsals. And so the toes experience a lot of bending stress. So compared to a chimpanzee or gorilla, our toes have gotten much shorter and straighter, which allows them to resist those bending stress and still act as a propulsive mechanism, pushing off. The Sasquatch, on the other hand, because of that mid-tarsal break, well, let me back up. Because of their flat foot, they don't walk like we do, with a heel strike and then spanning across the arch to the ball and then a toe off. Instead, their foot comes down relatively flat, and then the heel comes up with the mid-tarsal break, and the push-off is from the entire forefoot. And the toes are there for, when walking, for traction rather than propulsion. So they don't experience the bending stresses, and we don't see the shortening. In Sasquatch toes, their toes are probably 15% longer than our toes relative to foot length, especially midfoot length, because it's otherwise that ratio is diluted a little bit by their exceptional lengthening of the heel segment. In short, what that means is the Sasquatch have retained a much longer set of toes relative to their foot, and so it's like they have a foot with a bunch of fingers on it. If you can kind of to visualize it, and so I just a case in point. I mean, I have one example of a footprint where the toes slid into the mud and flexed really sharply and impressed very deeply, leaving a very distinctive profile imprint of the fifth digit. Well, that fifth toe on a 15-inch footprint was longer than my little finger. So imagine a Sasquatch foot with a set of toes that are, as long as my fingers, and with the musculature, the mass of muscle of the lower extremity of that 7-foot tall Sasquatch. That's a powerful grip, a powerful foot. And so, yeah, can they climb? You betcha they can climb. Of course, an 800-pound gorilla doesn't have much business going up in a tree, because just as a Sasquatch wouldn't. Because if they fall, a simple fall, I mean, even with humans and our size, a fall from 10 feet can be life-threatening. If you talk to climbers, free climbers and such, scramblers. So also there isn't much to attract them up into the trees, except maybe a vantage, a lookout. The fruits, the sugars that they're after in their diet are down in the shrub layer, the berries and so forth in the understory. Even the carbohydrates, say in pine nuts, just as bears don't actually, I mean, once in a while they'll chew on a sugar cone and get the nuts, but they usually rely on slave labor, indentured servitude. The squirrels do all the work. They collect the nuts and into middens. The bears sniff those out and pilfer them. And so the point simply being, there isn't much to attract a Sasquatch up into the trees. Maybe to park a baby, to get it up away from potential threats from predators and so forth. Sorry, it's a long answer to a short question, but there are lots of different facets, and I'm not known for my succinct responses.
Oh, no problem at all. Mark Napier asked, he says, has there been any repercussions to your life or career because of your study of Bigfoot?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that I guess is to be expected. And I had that moment, when I this kind of the hook was set when in 1996, in the spring of 1996, February, I actually was taken out and shown a long line of very fresh, just hours old footprints in the blues of southeastern Washington, northeastern Oregon by Paul Freeman. And I was pinching myself. These were so fresh, so clear, had so much detail. As I mentioned, the evidence of the mid-tarsal pressure ridge. Everything, all this started to crystallize at that point. But there was a moment, I've told this story many times, when that little imp, it's like in the cartoons, the little devil on the one shoulder and the angel on the other, or whatever. But one little imp was saying, "Do you really want to do this?" Because I had just come from a visit to Grover Krantz's lab. I was very familiar with all of the academic, the professional ridicule that Dr. Krantz had experienced and endured. And so that was, I was very aware of. And so that little imp saying, "Do you really want to do this? You really want to go down this path?" And the other little imp was saying, "How can you not? What a fascinating question. You're looking at footprints. My gosh, a Sasquatch actually walked right by here last night. And here's the evidence of it. How could you not?" And so obviously, you know which little imp won out in that argument. But it nearly cost me my job. I was, I don't like to say naive. There was a certain degree of naivete. It was more idealism. I was idealistic enough that I jumped into the deep end of the pool even before I had tenure, which provides some job security and an assurance of academic freedom, in spite of professions of academic freedom. It gives you a little more solid footing, and so I almost it was splitting hairs as far as the decision of whether I got to stay at the university or not. And my promotion to full professor was delayed by quite a period of time because of this. And, there were threats of litigation. I had to file complaints against some of the faculty for bad behavior and for prejudice and bias. And thankfully, sorry, just a sec. And so now I've got a dog to deal with. We've got an 8-month-old puppy who's still rather exuberant. But I hate to dwell on that part. It was a very eye-opening experience. Let's put it that way. Again, I was a bit of an idealist, and I thought that Grover was, for all his genius in many ways, he was quite a maverick. And not only was he attracted to controversial questions, much as I seem to be, but he had a knack for kind of going further out on the limb, or or behaving in unorthodox ways beyond what I would typically do. One of his famous stunts was when he molded a pair of pronounced brow ridges out of latex and wore it like a sun visor for a whole year, the better part of a year, to find out, what would be the effect of having that kind of anatomy. And so I thought, well, I'm much more mainstream. I'm already established as a functional morphologist, as a physical anthropologist, as an expert in primate and human locomotion. And so from that position, I felt confident that my investigations, my observations and interpretations would have some credibility and carry some weight. And I must say, it revealed the fact that the scientific community, as any cross section of humanity, is it's rife with all kinds of personalities, all kinds of dispositions and motivations and ethical and unethical attitudes and behaviors. There are people even in academia who get up in the morning, I guess, and they look in the mirror and they think, how can I make Dr. Meldrum's day uncomfortable today? What can I do to needle him. I mean, I'm too busy doing what I love, what attracted me to science. I mean, that's why I avoid, if I can, committee responsibilities and administrative responsibilities. I want to teach and do research. That's what attracted me. I mean, those other things are part of the professional world of academia, but ambitions to become a chair or a dean, I mean, that was the farthest thing from my mind. Never been a goal or ambition of mine. And so, yeah. But here we are. I'm reaching I've rounded third base. I'm reaching the final stretch of my full-time career, I guess you'd say. As retirement kind of looms on the horizon, and I hope I have made a positive impact. I hope I've kept that door ajar. It was very kind of serendipitous the way the stars sort of aligned, and Grover was able to pass that baton on to me, and I was able to carry on and build upon the foundation that he sort of laid as the principal face of academia in this arena. So, I mean, there's lots of other academics. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm singular, a singularity. There are other academics who are involved in this enterprise as well. Maybe not as openly or as to the degree that I have chosen to pursue it, but I interact with lots of colleagues, especially behind the scenes, and so it's an opportunity.
I've got a kind of a two-part question for you.
Okay.
When finding tracks like this, and especially since some of these tracks have been casted deep in the woods, what is the probability of somebody being able to fake a cast that would pass your level of scrutiny, the mid-tarsal break, and also the tracks that were found where one foot was deformed? I remember reading about those trackways. Is that the only example of a deformed trackway you found, or is that something that's kind of semi-common?
Well, to your first question about in remote areas, I mean, it's always a bit of a tricky proposition to say, well, these were found in a very remote area where no one would be likely to find them. So why would a hoaxer or someone place them there? Well, we wouldn't be talking about them if someone hadn't found them. So they were found, and so it kind of makes that point a little bit moot. But I'll resort to it. I've found tracks in extremely remote places where conducting field work, where the chances of anyone anticipating us being in that particular spot and having the wherewithal to reach that location in order to lay out fake evidence for us to stumble upon is pretty remote. So others hoaxing people, it's in those circumstances is pretty unlikely. Now, when you find them crossing a road or on a well-trodden trail or a frequented beach, those then it's different. But as far as being able to incorporate the kinds of details, the functional morphology of the foot has only in academia, in physical anthropology, when I began as an undergraduate, there were maybe only 3, 4, 5 of us at the graduate level, the doctoral student level, who were studying the aspects of the foot, and certainly few of us had really had the opportunity or the time to examine some of the footprint evidence for hominin evolution at that point. Now it's really caught on more. I mean, the next generation, there's probably a dozen or so people who publish on foot form and function of early hominins on a regular basis. But, there's only a few dozen people who have the wherewithal that could sit and have a conversation about the evolutionary history of as I've described it, the pattern and process of the emergence of the characteristics that define the human adaptation for walking on 2 feet. I mean, it's a pretty exclusive club, I have to say. And, The only other people who have some of that kind of technical knowledge are orthopedists and podiatrists, the clinicians. But they usually have a very narrow perception of normal human foot function and form and abnormal. And as far as comparative examples, they're wanting, they're underinformed or uninformed. I've had some really protracted, drawn out discussions with a couple of podiatrists who thought that, the mid-tarsal break was ridiculous as an adaptation. It was a pathology. It was a dysfunction. It was an injury. Break kind of evokes that notion of an injury. The word break in this case just means an axis of flexion where it breaks its alignment. It flexes. And I would simply retort, well, his comment was someone who had a mid-tarsal break would not be able to walk across the room. And I says, have you ever looked at a chimpanzee? They walk across the room just fine, and they have a mid-tarsal break. They have a flat, flexible foot with a mid-tarsal break. So don't tell me that this is not a rational, viable adaptation. It is. So anyway, it's so for someone to incorporate the kinds of details that are evident in the anatomy of these footprints to hoax that level of sophistication. I mean, usually hoaxes usually take two forms. One is they take a pre-existing cast of a footprint and use that as a model to make either stompers or whatever. I mean, if unless you want to go back to the historical precedent of a carved wooden foot using a 2x10 plank and strapping it to the boots like the Wallaces did, well, what's his name? I just went blank on his name. Rant Mullins. Beyond that, the second is if not using a pre-existing, then they try to model something. They try to create some sort of a prosthetic, and so those are usually obvious. I mean, with a little bit of familiarity. I mean, there've been a number of cases where someone has presented a copy of an existing footprint, tried to pass it off as a cast that they made of evidence they collected. And it was very easy to say, well, you've got a nice copy of Al Hodgson's cast from 1963 at Bluff Creek, and or whatever. And then in the second case, the anatomy immediately speaks if the track is clear. Now that brings up the next point, and that is, footprints represent or span a considerable spectrum of variability in the clarity in the conditions of the footprint. And so, you often see these remarkably clear, detailed tracks or footprint casts, but a lot of the evidence that I have to deal with, that I look at or sort through, they are much less clear. They're much more ambiguous. They're melted out snow tracks. They're in dry duff. They're, and people, of course, get a little pareidolia in their brain, and everything that has even the slightest resemblance to an oblong foot shape takes on that identity as it becomes attributed to Sasquatch. So there's a lot of sifting of the chaff that takes place on a day-to-day basis, and it's motivated me to try to, again, the educator in me, to try to describe and teach what the distinguishing characteristics are. There's always a risk in doing that. You let the cat out of the bag about what are the features that distinguish a Sasquatch footprint, and then gives more ammunition to the hoaxers to try to incorporate. But even then, I don't know if you saw the episode. Les Stroud hired a Hollywood special effects guy to fabricate some footprints. he provided him with a very clear example, the Grays Harbor County casts that were made by Deputy Sheriff Dennis Hereford. And it was so funny because he brought in a number of tracks, the casts, to show me, and he had a couple of iterations. And he said one was made up in Canada near his home and in Ontario, and the other was, I can't remember where it was, he claimed. That I just happened to have poured plaster in the mold of the Hereford track in order to demonstrate that process of cast making. So there was a copy of that cast just right there on the counter. And when I looked at it, again, the familiarity gives you the heads up. I looked at that, and there's some distinctive features of the shapes of the toes of that individual. I go, well, there's something about this, and kind of familiar looking. And I would really want to have the time to. I was trying to be diplomatic. I mean, here we are on camera. I didn't want to say, well, what are you showing me these fake footprints for? But I just reached over and picked up this cast, the actual Hereford cast, and set it down beside it and said, well, it looks like there might have been a little inspiration. Someone may have gotten the better of you here. And that little wry grin as the corner of his mouth goes up, and he acknowledged, and that was actually the model that he'd given the hoaxer. So that turned out well. But yeah, quite honestly, hoaxing, of all of my interaction with potential footprint evidence, hoaxing is probably less than 10%. 80% is misidentification, reading too much into the footprint, or bear tracks. When I do a workshop on tracking or whatever, I spend a lot of time pointing out the differences between bear tracks and Sasquatch tracks. And just recently, there was another piece of evidence that came across my table. It was a somewhat desiccated, decaying carcass of a lower limb, and the skin was largely missing. I mean, it was largely degraded and rotted away, but the toes were still visible. The shape of the sole was still visible, and you could get kind of a sense of the bones of the shin, the lower leg, and it was a bear. It was a bear as clearly as could be. I mean, you could establish which was the fibula and tibia. You could see the very tapered heel coming back, and the very characteristic array of toes, with the inner toe more thumb-like and short, and the outer toes much longer. And yeah, so that tends to be the case.
Dr. Meldrum, you spoke earlier about the kind of the evolutionary changes in the arch of the foot, the forefoot, and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
If you had to make an educated guess, do you think that Sasquatch is something that evolved divergently with us, or do you think it's previously up our evolutionary line?
Well, I think there's two possibilities. The two hypotheses that I put forward for discussion, for consideration, are on opposite sides of that split between us and the great apes. Gigantopithecus has long been considered as a possible ancestor, and I think it's a valid model, even though we have a very meager fossil record for what that creature is. We can say a lot about its adaptation based on its teeth and fragments of jaws, but it's the right size in the right place at the right time as a possible ancestor. I mean, it's a giant ape. It's a giant ape with a flat face, with enlarged post-canine teeth, with very short canines that wear end to end. One of the classic or typical description of those who actually see the Sasquatch teeth is that they're so hopefully don't have a problem with the connection here. So that's valid. That's valid. It would be a giant ape, and it has. I mean, we don't know how Gigantopithecus locomoted, whether it was bipedal or quadrupedal. But when you're a giant ape and you're on the ground, I mean, it certainly was terrestrial, as we said earlier. 800-pound gorilla has no business climbing up in a tree. It's too dangerous. I mean, it's to be avoided. And so if you're committed to the ground, you have one of two choices. You either walk on two or you walk on four. And when you have evolved a rib cage and shoulder morphology as this characteristic of humans and great apes that's been shaped by the behaviors associated with climbing, with overhead arm reaching and hoisting and arm hanging, it changes the orientation of the shoulder blade and the shoulder joint, so that when you come to the ground, and the very mobile wrist and elbow, extension of the elbow, you put all those things on the ground, and when you get down on the ground, I mean, you don't do well quadrupedally. You know, a lot of people that are down on their hands to do push-ups feel severe discomfort in their wrist. So that's why you buy those little hand grips, or do like I do, and just you do push-ups. I can't even get my hand in the picture. You do push-ups on the back of your knuckles to keep your wrists straight. I mean, this is why gorillas walk on their knuckles, to avoid the stresses on their wrists that they have because of the morphology that has evolved for arm hanging. So the point of that being, I think when it comes to Gigantopithecus, I won't be surprised at all when they eventually find a femur of a Gigantopithecus and it has a hip like us, that it walked bipedally, and it had evolved that convergently or in parallel to us. Now, there are those that would argue, well, yeah, but the more conservative interpretation would be that bipedalism is a hominin trait. It's a trait that's characteristic on the split from that common ancestor shared with great apes. And if that's the case, then yeah, something like a robust Australopithecine. I often show a slide when I do a talk of the skull of one of those species, Paranthropus boisei, the East African form, for which we have fairly complete cranial and mandibular fossils. And you put it up against Patty in the Patterson-Gimlin film, Patty that was filmed about a decade or two before we actually had the full descriptions and analyses of the Paranthropus skull. You put those two side by side, and point for point, they line up. They're exactly proportionate to one another, and show the same kind of flat face, deep jaws, lack of canines, presumably thick enamel. I mean, the big, massive teeth, which is the only reason for having the jaw proportions that you see on the Paranthropus, or on Patty for that matter. I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, that's one of the most striking observations that you could ask for as far as the credibility of the Patterson-Gimlin film. It's just remarkable. I mean, anyway, so hypothesis 2 then would be a very early offshoot of the hominin radiation, like a robust Australopithecine, which achieved gigantic proportions as presumably that species spread across southern Asia into the northern latitudes of Asia, especially Eastern Asia, before crossing the land bridge into North America. I think that's a very viable hypothesis as well. But with the qualification, see, we don't have material culture. We don't have all the accoutrements that are associated with Homo and its lineages, Homo erectus, ergaster, Homo heidelbergensis, in our own species. So I do not advocate the hypothesis that this is some form of forest people, in the sense of they're on par, they're equivalent to Homo sapiens, just adapted to a forest environment, at one with nature, that they don't need all these other accoutrements. I mean, I never say never, but show me the evidence, show me the beef, so to speak, because all the evidence that we have, and it's a lot in my opinion, all points to and is consistent with, a model like this Gigantopithecus or Paranthropus, which are basically just straddling, like I said, on either side of that fork, and they're not divided by very much morphologically. Taxonomically is where the argument rests.
On a lot of the tracks you found, you've actually located dermal ridging. Is that
Yes.
something that's unique to hominids and ongids, or is that something that's seen in other places in the animal kingdom?
It's found in all primates and also some other forms of arboreal mammals, like possums. They have a form of dermatoglyphic. It's not as complex as what is found, and they don't have the degree of coalescence of the pads into essentially a single sole pad, as is the case with sole or palm pad, as is the case with the primates, especially the monkeys and apes. So it's but it's an adaptation for climbing. The soulless or hairless skin and the papillary ridges that are crowned by a series of eccrine sweat glands that keep that surface moist and increase the coefficient of friction as an adaptation for gripping and climbing on surfaces. So yeah, there have been a few, and very few, I should say. I mean, when in the 300 casts that I have, there's only a dozen and a half that have appreciable amounts of dermatoglyphics. Every once in a while, you'll get just a little lingering bit here or there. That it doesn't. The dermatoglyphics, in order for them to show up in a cast, require a series of circumstances. First, they have to be evident on the foot. It is possible to kind of, especially if you've been walking a lot, to kind of wear those down a little bit on the foot itself and make them a little patchier. It has to transfer to the footprint, which requires that the substrate be of a particulate size fine enough that it will pick up that level of detail. So that's why so many examples from the Blue Mountains that Grover Krantz focused on, because that part of Washington is very similar to our southern Idaho here, where the soils have a high loess content, this glacial silt sediment that is like talcum powder, flour. And so when it's dry or when it's wet, it's very clay and will hold that shape pretty well. But even under ideal conditions, if it is wet, it's usually because of rain, because of moisture. Under those conditions, very quickly, gravity literally pulls those features out, flattens them out, obliterates them. In dry powdery substance, a truck driving by cause a cloud of rain down and obliterate that fine detail, just mask it with a shower of dust. And so and then you have to find them while they're fresh enough. The tracks that I examined in '96, like I said, were so fresh, and it was in spring. The snows had just melted back. It was a cloudy, overcast day with a little light, periodic, off and on drizzle, intermittent drizzle. And when I knelt down, when we were first shown those, there were dermatoglyphics in the tracks, in some of the tracks. By the time we got back a couple hours later with the materials to make plaster casts, everything had been obliterated by, or what little bit had remained had been obliterated by the weather conditions, inundation of rain and water and such. But then you have to have someone who's adept enough at making a plaster cast, gets the pour just the right consistency so as not to obliterate those fine details and have it transfer to the cast. So there's that whole string of circumstances. So like I said, there's only about a half a dozen or a dozen examples in my lab. The ones that are there are pretty impressive, and it's consistent with higher primate dermatoglyphics, no question.
So if you've got a track that has the indications of mid-tarsal break and dermal ridgings, what are the chances of someone being able to hoax that?
Well, right. I mean, it starts to stack the evidence, stack the deck. And we've got some examples. Well, not, yeah, no, there probably are. I was trying to think. Um, there's one, I mean, there's other ways too for that mid-tarsal flexibility to manifest itself, that degree of mobility, in addition to the pressure ridge that results from the heel coming up and the pressure being causing displacement of soil from under the forefoot. The flexibility of the foot as it conforms to the substrate, or as the body angle turns, so rotation at the knee with the change of direction, say, causes varying degrees of what we call supination or pronation of the foot. And that motion of supination, raising the medial side, the big toe side of the foot, versus pronation, flatten it down. Most people have heard of pronation. You know, if you have a pronated foot, someone who's very heavy or obese and has their knees rotate inward, they have a kind of knock knee, they may have a flattened arch or a collapsed arch, in which case the footprint kind of has a convexity on the inner side. You know, if they get out of the swimming pool and go walking across the cement, you know, they don't have an hourglass shape. Instead, they have a very broad, flat flat footprint with a convexity on the inner surface. That twisting motion takes place at the mid-tarsal joints. And so the Sasquatch shows a greater range of motion in that regard than a typical human does. Not someone with not here excluding someone with collapsed arches with a pathology, but with normal foot function. And I can think, you know, when you asked that question, one example that popped into mind was one that has extensive dermatoglyphics, and we've got a right and a left cast of feet, one of which is very pronated in its position, the other is notably supinated, and you can see the imposed angle between the forefoot and hindfoot that when the foot is supinated, in the contrast between those two. I mean, it's really remarkable to see the difference between those two. And other examples come to mind. In fact, another example of that same individual. Unfortunately, this is one thing that's frustrating too. It would be really great if we had two tracks from two different sites, two different investigators of the same individual whose footprint showed repeated dermatoglyphic characteristics. But unfortunately, because it's all often so patchy, the preservation rather, and transfer and so forth, transfer and preservation of the dermatoglyphics is so patchy because of that string of circumstances I described. We don't have, and I've tried to establish, but we don't have an example of two footprints where there are identifiable characteristics in a particular spot present in both examples. So it comes up short, you know, which gives the critics no end to fodder for their arguments against it. But
Got a super chat from William Bedard. He says, "How and when you retire, you will always be known as the pioneer, having the balls to bring the truth to light." Thank you, Dr. Meldrum.
well, thank you for that. I mean, like I said, I have stood on the shoulders of some that have gone before me. I mean, Dr. Krantz is really to be credited. He really was an insightful investigator, maybe a little overconfident. So he didn't quite do his due diligence in some respects, which cost him some acknowledgement and some credibility. But I mean, we've differed on interpretation of a few points, a few things like, we didn't really talk about. You mentioned the Bosberg cripplefoot. There was a slight difference in the interpretation of the inferred skeleton because he was close, but he didn't quite. See, his expertise was not in foot form and function. I mean, not primarily. He had never published on that or worked on that in depth as a primary research investigator, and so he was on the right track, but he came up just a little short of recognizing the significance of the mid-tarsal pressure ridge. He did recognize the difference in proportions, and unfortunately that was misconstrued by his critic. He made the statement, for example, I just stumbled upon it the other day on a Facebook feed. He made the statement that the ankle was moved forward on the Sasquatch foot, and Dr. David Daglin, took him to task over that as being an illogical statement. You can't move the ankle. Well, what he meant and what Daglin should have acknowledged was not the ankle moving, but the relative position of the ankle was further forward due to an elongated heel segment to increase the leverage due to the mass, and especially because of the mid-tarsal break. Although Grover hadn't recognized the mid-tarsal break, he simply attributed the elongation, even in a human-like foot, to the massive size, to increase the leverage. And he acknowledged a foreshortening somewhat of the forefoot. He also, though, argued that since, as I described, human toes have gotten shorter to resist bending stresses of walking on two legs, that the Sasquatch, with its even greater mass, would have even shorter toes because of the to avoid even greater bending stresses. And so in his reconstruction of the Bosworth cripplefoot, for example, he put rather short toes, very short toes, skeletal outlines there in his reconstruction. Well, if he had recognized, as I proposed, the mid-tarsal break and the push off through the entire forefoot, not just the toes, but the entire forefoot, relieves the toes of those bending stresses and therefore allows for the retention of a longer toe. So the Sasquatch has a toe that's somewhat intermediate in length between us and a chimpanzee, almost on par with those foot of Australopithecines, like Lucy. And so I revisited the cripplefoot and revised that, which made it much more congruent with other reconstructions I had done of other feet based on features of the outline, bony landmarks that indicated the positions of joints and so on. And it was remarkably consistent and creates a very coherent foot. I mean, so much so that when I had the opportunity to speak at Massachusetts General Hospital before the entire podiatry department, and they invited the orthopedists and all the podiatrists from the local communities and the surrounding communities there. And, so for an hour and a half, I got to talk shop with all these clinicians and present and showcase, not only my model of form and function of the Sasquatch foot, but highlight this interesting case study of this pathology. And man, they were on the edge of their seats. It was amazing to see the engagement and interaction and discussion about all the possible interpretation. Was this a crushing injury? Was it a genetic pathology? Was it was it skew foot? Was it metatarsus abductus? And so on and so on. But they were quite comfortable with the anatomy, and I mean, so much so that were it not for the scale, it's like when you bring out the casts then, and they're 17 inches long. So I left a copy, a replica set of the right and left foot with the department chairman. They were on display in the department office for a long time, as far as I know. I don't know if they're still there. That was quite a number of years ago, but very interesting. See, they didn't have a dog in the fight as far as the implications for models of human evolution. It was purely form and function and clinical diagnosis, and they were detached from the scientific implications, and saw no problem with what they were looking at. No reason to suspect it was a hoax, And so, very, very fascinating reaction.
Dr. Meldrum, question here.
Yes,
In reference to what Anthony was saying earlier about some of the features he witnessed in his encounter where it was more aboriginal in nature versus some of the other encounters we've heard about that was more ape-like in features, would you say this is more of a, would you, in your educated opinion, would it be more of an evolved primate or more of a derivative of a hominid?
Right. Well, I mean, to be clear, we are primates. So primates is an order, and then subdivide. So the question, which side of the division between us and the great apes? So the pongids. And that we get hung up on semantics. I mean, at one time it was pongids and hominids, but now hominids includes the African apes and pongids is orangutans.
Gotcha.
And so you just have to make sure everything is in context. So let's just say great apes and human ancestors.
Gotcha.
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, we have all these anecdotal descriptions, and I've learned from experience dealing with witnesses, and as well-intentioned and sincere as they are, what they see can be influenced by expectations, past experiences, and so forth. And our minds are great at filling in gaps. And I mean, this has been one of the criticisms by psychologists about eyewitness testimony, is that memory is reconstructive, and the very act of retelling a story alters it. It has an impact on the way then you remember it and retell it. Talk about the subject pertaining to your story can influence the way you express and interpret your observation or experience. So it's always. I mean, that's not to say we throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's just to qualify the inferences we draw upon. There was an interesting paper. You'll have to look it up in the Journal of Scientific Exploration. It was a researcher at the University of Arizona. He had been working on a project with the late Richard Greenwell, who also was quite a pioneer in the field of cryptozoology, very knowledgeable man. And they were trying to do some sort of statistical analysis of eyewitness data and interpretation of how the value and the pros and cons of such data. And it's a fascinating paper. You look, I can't think now of the principal author, King, I want to say, but it's in the Journal of Scientific Exploration. But one of the things that they did draw attention to was in the past 15 years, there's a researcher who has really advocated the value of eyewitness testimony. That many people, their recollection of events is really pretty darn good under most circumstances. So back to your question. So whether the nose is hooded or whether it looks like an ape, or those are details I'm not sure if I can really rely on, especially at some distance. If there's, depending on the lighting, depending on the angle of view, etc., it's hard to know for sure. Now, having said that, here I'll introduce something this I think is kind of interesting that I don't often get a chance to talk about. Just recently in the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, which is the journal I edit, an online scholarly journal, a registered academic journal with a board of editorial board that helps me out of PhDs and other professionals with appropriate credentials. A paper was just published therein about mitochondrial introgression. And basically, this gentleman who was quite intrigued by the hypothesis proposed by Meldrum, but found that the evidence just didn't bear up her hypothesis as it was presented. But looked into it further, and what he found was that, and there was precedent in the examples provided by other mammal species, where the hybridization between two, even limited hybridization between two populations, could result in the introgression, that is sort of the assimilation and dispersion within the population of the mitochondria of the colonizing population. And so the argument be that on rare events where there is successful crossing between humans and Sasquatch, which itself is a question, and that bears on ape versus hominin, because chimps and humans cannot cross. Their sperm and ova will not naturally unite because there aren't recognition factors and etc. that would allow that to occur naturally. So a human chimp hybrid would have to be accomplished with in vitro fertilization, in implanting the pronucleus into the ovum of the chimpanzee or vice versa. So, but if in fact, as there is anecdotal evidence that would suggest the precedent for some rare hybridization events, and it were such that the female was the human, so a scenario, say, of as we have examples in Native American stories, for example, of a female being a human female abducted, being held prisoner for a period of time, giving birth to an offspring, becoming pregnant and giving birth to an offspring. There are a couple examples that I'm very well documented examples. I mean, well documented anecdotal, independently corroborated anecdotal evidence of such happening, in which case the female remained amongst the human population. The offspring grew fast, became large, was very strong, was mentally deficient, never learned to speak properly, and died of various ailments at an early age, in early teens, in both instances. Really interesting stories. One of them's recounted, if you want to find one, is in Rob Alley's book, The Raincoat Sasquatch. But scenario of the female giving birth, and if the offspring remained with the Sasquatch population in some form, successfully made it to reproductive age, if it was a female offspring. See, the important reason it has to be a female human is that the female contributes the mitochondria to the offspring. So this offspring, this hybrid offspring, would have cells that had human mitochondrial genes, but it would have a nucleus that had a mixture of genes, one set from the Sasquatch, one set from the human. All right, and so and conceivably, phenotypically, the appearance would be a mixture of characteristics depending on the expression of those genes. If that female reached sexual maturity, crossed back with a Sasquatch, had more offspring, and some were female, they would still have human mitochondria. Now the genes, through recombination that occurs in the nuclear genes, would be shuffled to a varying degree. There would be dilution of the human characteristics. And with each successive back cross, you'd get more and more dilution of the human features, right? While maintaining human mitochondria. Absolutely indistinguishable from, other than the accumulation of the rate of mutation that normally occurs. So what does this is an interesting scenario. One, since most tests of potential Sasquatch samples, like hair, what is the test that's usually done? It's usually a mitochondrial gene. Like cytochrome B or cytochrome oxidase 2 or whatever. And on those rare occasions when we get DNA from a hair sample, which is rare because most of the Sasquatch hair typically has an acellular medulla. There's very little DNA in there. If they get DNA, it does invariably comes back as human. And so it's either thought that it's contaminated through mishandling, or it's a human hair, just simply a human hair that was picked up extraneously. Well, the third possibility that I've suggested would be that we're just not sequencing enough to distinguish between two species that may be different by less than 1% of their genome. But the fourth possibility now is this introgression model, that it looks human because for all intents and purposes, it is human mitochondria. And until we turn our attention to the nuclear DNA, we won't get a signal that suggests a non-human element. Now, back to your original question then, this, if you think about this, and this is a very attractive model to consider. I mean, whether we have enough evidence to really advocate for this or not at this point remains to be seen, but it's something I think we have to consider and keep in mind. And the implication for your question is that now, if this has dispersed, over the past, in more than 200 years, I mean, if this has been taking place even before colonization by European settlers, that's been taking place with indigenous populations for the past 30,000, 40,000 years, then it's possible to have spread quite far. And an interesting possibility is that you get occasionally this almost like an atavistic expression of these human genes. So maybe the Sasquatch nose is more pongid-like, more primitive in the sense of pongid or early hominin, but every once in a while you get the good old hooded nose of gene pops up. So I don't rule out that possibility, because I've had people that I trust very much and who have had observations, or who have interviewed witnesses that they trust very much, that describe a considerable variation in the expression of some of those facial features. So we may be looking at a more variable species as a result of the effects of and I don't think it's wanton. I don't think it's rampant hybridization, but it only takes a few of these events in some cases for that introgression process. It's just what they call, the lucky lineage to establish itself and persist.
So it's like a genetic dilution type of thing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. As far as the nuclear genes which control, the appearance, the facial features, and we get descriptions of some individuals, some Sasquatch, and this is true with all species anyway, but some that are lanky, some that are massive, some that are very broad-shouldered, some not so much. Those could be also related to age, it could be related to gender, but it may also be just, especially in a population that is potentially very dispersed and fragmented across the present habitat, which limits gene flow and promotes pockets of particular care. I mean, this is how, we have, and I know it's not politically correct, but whether you call it whatever term you choose to use, whether you talk about races or subpopulations or demes, in the past 40,000, 60,000 years, look at the variation in the appearance of modern Homo sapiens.
Yes.
That's a fairly recent type of
it's
skin tone,
it seems like it's
head shape and eye shape and so forth.
Yeah, like dominant. It's just dominant and recessive.
Isn't some of it
traits?
Pardon?
Aren't some of them like
Somewhat.
some of the Sasquatch people say they act autistic?
I know that's an interesting theory that Chris Noel has proposed, and again, my initial reaction to that was, while it's fascinating, it's interesting to draw the interesting parallels that he draws attention to. I have a hard time visualizing an entire population, entire species evolving, or for those that for autism to become fixed in a population and the dominant condition. I just have a hard time with that. But I mean, we're still learning so much about what autism is, what causes it, its manifestation. I guess it's possible. I mean, there are those who suggest that in humans, autism is becoming, whether it's from environmental factors or whatever, or just an increased awareness and diagnosis of it, that whether it's truly increasing in incidence and rate of incidence in human populations, or, as I said, we're just more aware of it, more cognizant of it. So I don't know.
Couldn't it be like interbreeding? No.
Well, yeah. So in inbreeding depression, that's possible. I mean, there are. I mean, there have been studies done, say, on mountain gorillas, for example, where the population declined to almost less than 200 individuals. It's now bounced up to well over 1,000, and they don't show any evidence of inbreeding. In fact, of inbreeding depression, meaning what that means is the proportion of harmful recessive traits that would be likely to show up when they're combined in offspring that are homozygous recessive. Then, I mean, this is why humans have a lot of junk, a lot of harmful recessive traits, so that if you marry someone very closely related, like a cousin, the chances that they might have some of that junk, which is going to potentially combine in your offspring, is high. So if you marry farther away, there's less chance that they have those same bad genes, harmful genes. And so but the one report that I read about the mountain gorillas said that it appeared that there had been strong selection pressure to suppress the presence of those genes in those populations, that they tolerated inbreeding to a much greater degree. So, the idea of a minimum viable population is kind of a nebulous, it's used in conservation circles quite, the deeper the gene pool, the better off you are, right? That you always advocate for that, of adaptability. But the actual numbers for minimum viable population are very elusive and can only be established through extensive field testing and laboratory research to determine what the genetic load is. That is, what is the proportion of harmful genes. And some populations have very few. And so there's this ballpark figure given for vertebrate species. I mean, that's a broad category of about 1,000 individuals as a benchmark for a minimum viable population. All vertebrates. I mean, from fish to elephants. I mean, that's too broad of a generalization. But nevertheless, the figures about how many Sasquatch are likely out there that I've offered and discussed, are in that range or higher. Several thousand in North America, I would estimate, but not much more than that.
Dr. Meldrum, were you able to examine the cast known as the Skookum cast, and what were your findings?
Yes, the Skookum cast was made near Skookum Meadows in southern Washington State in the Cascades, and it purported to be a site where it was on a turnabout on a narrow Forest Service road that was bulldozed, and it was just dirt, mud. Not wet mud. There was a low spot that did fill up with a puddle and kind of a halo of very loamy clay soil. But vehicles used it as a turnabout. There was a lot of wildlife traffic across this spot. The members of that expedition, I don't remember this, if the expedition had a title at that time or not, but whatever. They had been baiting areas with produce, cantaloupes and watermelons and apples and so forth. And they had left a pile of fruit right sort of in that puddle, and had put a camera. I don't know. They had not put a camera on that one. They had been cruising the roads with a thermal camera from their vehicle, but they did hang a pheromone chip. I remember they mentioned that right adjacent to the spot. Came back the next day, and the fruit had been pilfered by something, and there were apple peels all over. Apple peels are some animals don't prefer the rind of fruit, and apple peelings are actually really tough to chew. Requires quite a lot of force, and sometimes they're bitter, and so anyway, as they looked, I remember Leroy Fish at the time was wildlife biologist, and he had walked up close to look, and then he looked down and he saw features that caught his eye. He almost was standing on them, but he was just adjacent, and it appeared that something hairy had sat down reclined or sat down in the mud as it had reached over to grab some of this fruit. There were actually apple peelings fallen down in between patches that appeared to be hair-covered body surfaces. And as we examined it, as I looked at it and the confirmation of it, I mean, it looked like a pair or sort of asymmetric pair of butt cheeks, the gluteus and the thigh, and the back of the leg and heel, where the heel had sort of dug in as it was reaching, and it was leaning on one elbow. There was what clearly looked like an elbow impression with hairless skin surface and wrinkly, and then the hair striations down to the heel of the palm, that almost like a fist. And I did a kind of a reconstruction. Actually, had one of my students snap some Polaroids of me on the floor trying to approximate that kind of position. That was actually the basis of the drawing that was produced, that appears in Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, of what Sasquatch might have been doing. The thing that so impressed me was that shucks, and I'm getting to the point where names, it'll jump. Rick Knoll went to the Seattle Zoo and filmed the gorillas, and he happened to catch it just when they were giving the gorillas some fruit, and they had put out a bunch of apples, and this female gorilla was in exactly the posture I had proposed, and she was leaning on one elbow, and she'd reach over, she'd pick up an apple from the pile, and she'd bite off a piece, kind of peel the rind, the apple peel off, spit it out, and it would fall down right between her legs in exactly the same place where the peelings were found at the Skookum site, based on my reconstruction of what it was doing. Then she would set that apple down. She'd marked it. This is hers. She'd push in her heel and reach across and grab a second one. She was digging in her heel the exact same way that we proposed, based on these indentations in this one that looked just like a heel impression, with a very distinctive calcaneal tendon, the Achilles tendon, prominent in the impression. Now, the skeptics looked at it. I mean, one of the first things we did was what else could it be? Well, the only other animal that would be that big would be something like a bear. There's no bear tracks or bear sign, or an elk. And there were elk tracks, but they weren't directly associated with the imprint, they walked across the imprint at an angle all the way through the wall, the muddy turnabout. And one of the first things we did here in Pocatello, we have a zoo that only has indigenous species. It's not exotic. So they have this big paddock with the deer and elk and bison. And I went over it with a big, great big colored printout, excellent photograph of the cast and pictures, 8x10s of the imprint in the mud and so forth, and had the keepers take a look. And I said, does this look familiar? Does this look what you're familiar with seeing these ungulates recline? And they go, well, there's some resemblances, but no, that's not consistent. And the big question was, where were the hoof prints? I mean, an elk that's down in that posture cannot just levitate and float away. They have to put their feet under the center of mass and stand up. If you've ever seen an elk get up, first the hind feet come in and they're on this front part of their wrist, and then they put their hooves underneath and stand up and walk away. And there just wasn't. The flow of the hair didn't match the body parts that would have to be responsible for the supposed, if this was an elk recline with an elk haunch and the wrists and heel and so forth. So it's fascinating. I mean, but the thing is, the problem is, it's like a Rorschach ink blot or a piece of modern art that you might see in the waiting room of your dentist's office. Most people look at it and they wouldn't be able to interpret it from either of those examples. And so at one time, John Green he had commissioned some nice replicas to be made, duplicates out of fiberglass, and they were excellently executed. He wanted me to rent a truck and take these on exhibit and go across country and visit universities and talk to various professors of anthropology and zoos and zoologists and so forth. And I said, well, yeah, that's possible, but I would much rather, if we were going to do that, I'd much rather have a selection of footprint casts and argue the case based on the unmistakable anatomy and appearance of these footprint casts than rather than this, sensational but so obtuse and abstract representation. So that never happened, obviously. And it's just kind of, those who can see and appreciate and look beyond the mark or beyond what some think is obvious, it's not, are intrigued by it. Those who are skeptical immediately just write it off as an elk imprint, and yet can't account for all of the features that contradict it simply being an elk imprint. So
I've coming down on the side of it being legit casting of an adult Sasquatch. It just, like you said, that without any hoof prints, it just doesn't make any sense. It could be an elk.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So it's intriguing. I mean, it's whether it's overrated, I'm not sure, but I have my own opinions of that, but nevertheless, it should not be offhandedly dismissed. I mean, inconclusive certainly, but not offhandedly dismissed. I think that's done very naively and ignorantly.
I agree. We had a super chat from William Bedard. He says, I don't want to interrupt the Bigfoot conversation, but do you have any info about the Dogman? We all appreciate you spending your night with us, Dr. Meldrum. Much respect.
Thanks. Well, not a lot. I must say that my involvement with the topic of the Dogman has been rather peripheral. I did one interview which was featuring some of the reports of, quote, dogmen in the South on the condition that they let me explore one hypothesis. And that was, they were very interested in what they were calling the rougarou. And I thought that was really interesting because I grew up a real fan of the Johnny Quest cartoon series,
I
and one
love
of
that.
the episodes was the loup-garou up in Canada with the Canadian loggers and lumberjacks and so forth. And so it really kind of intrigued me. And my notion was, the thing I wanted to discuss was that for these Creole people who have the French traditions, the stories of the dog or of the werewolf were, have a lot of historical significance. The loup-garou or the rouge-garou, and so for someone with that kind of again, like we talked about earlier, frame of reference, background experience has a lot of influence on the way we interpret things we see and so forth. And so for someone with that frame of reference, anything that's big and hairy and scary could be the rouge-garou, a werewolf. So whether it actually has a snout, pointy ears, and a long bushy tail, I mean, those seem to be really distinguishing characteristics if those are real characteristics of a real species. So my question was, are they simply seeing a Sasquatch, but not seeing it clearly or closely and seeing it as a Dogman? I haven't seen any evidence. There's no footprint evidence to corroborate the Dogman. Unless you go, well, you can't tell their footprints. You can't distinguish them from wolf tracks or from coyote tracks. It doesn't make any sense. And it's just like the guy who stood up at a conference and played a recording of a Sasquatch vocalization, and someone politely pointed out that it was a barred owl that he was hearing. He says, "Oh no, they can imitate barred owls." All right, well, if they imitate them that well that an expert can't tell the difference, then how do you know what you're listening to is a Sasquatch and not a barred owl? They kind of missed that point. So it's the same sort of thing with the footprints attributed to the Dogman that can't be distinguished from other. It's like one time they came to my lab with a chupacabra footprint. And so they didn't actually share it with me. They wanted to get the initial reaction, but they gave enough that I anticipated. So I had laid out on the bench top, I had a nice big timber wolf, a coyote, several examples of domestic dogs, large domestic dog breeds. I had a cougar and I had a bobcat. And we brought out theirs, and yes, there was a very canid looking, and we just simply kind of went up and down along this row and stopped at the one that bore the greatest resemblance. And there was no question, it was a dog. It was a domestic dog. So I said, if you think this is a chupacabra, then you have to argue, well, why isn't it a dog when it looks like a dog? If it, like I said, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And so I don't mean to make light. This is a process that you have to apply some common sense. And so, but my charge would simply be to those who raise questions about the possible existence of something like a Dogman, which has only recently gained in popularity and presence in the social media. Where's the evidence? Where's the footprint evidence of such creatures, and how do they fit in the ecology and so forth and so forth? We have a context for Sasquatch. We have a scientific context, even though science has not fully acknowledged and recognized, but the context, the theoretical context for such a species now, as opposed to 50 years ago, is absolutely framed in. There's no reason, for anyone who says they can't exist, therefore they don't exist, they don't know what they're talking about. They certainly can exist. The possibility of such a species as Sasquatch, very, very real. Well, like I said, well framed theoretically. The question is the evidence conclusive? Well, no, not yet, but it certainly is persuasive and compelling and mounting, as I said. What's the probability that such a creature has persisted despite our efforts to recognize it and to establish its existence? Now, if you turn to the Dogman, where's the scientific? Well, there really isn't one. And so you have to resort to the paranormal. Now, maybe that's a dimension that has yet to be fully understood, that has merit and implications that I'm not, as a scientist, at least wearing that cap, ready to acknowledge. But that's for right now. I think it sits squarely within the paranormal.
I had another question for you. I'm trying to remember what it was. Oh yeah, with the Josh Gates show Expedition X, when he was in the Himalayas, he casted a what he believed was a Yeti footprint. I believe they sent that track to you. Can you tell me about that?
They did, yes. The one, anyway, that turned out to be quite interesting. It was lower in elevation, where they found this. They heard some sounds of something crossing the creek. Now, I'm thinking, I hope I'm remembering the right one. I've had a couple of footprint casts come from Josh. There was one, the most recent one actually was a large bear. And that was very easily demonstrated. But the one some years ago, the one that now is at Disney World, I think it is, in Florida. That one was really interesting, and not what I would typically associate with the Yeti. In addition to the Yeti, whose footprints, based on a very limited sample, quite honestly, though, but the most interesting and the most compelling couple of footprint attributed to the Yeti looked very much like an ape with a divergent big toe. These tracks look very much like a Sasquatch track. In fact, I could open my drawers of my collection. I pull out examples that were remarkably similar in its size and shape and proportion, and that very distinctive splay, not divergence of the big toe, but just splay of the toes. Put my hand in there. Splay of the toes to a remarkable degree that you wouldn't see in a modern human, but some of the Sasquatch tracks have shown that feature. So, having said that, I should emphasize that while the Yeti is distinct from Sasquatch, there are reports of Sasquatch-like creatures distributed throughout eastern and southern Asia, all the way west over to the Caucasus Mountains of Russia. And it's really fascinating. One time I was on a trip. I picked up a magazine in the airport shop, and it was a science magazine. It had an article on the imperiled status of the Asian tiger. And I opened it up, and they had this graphic with a map that showed the historical distribution of the Asian tigers and the remarkable fragmentation of their distribution today, and restricted, shrunken, retracted distribution today. Well, what jumped out at me was I had been collecting examples of Sasquatch-like creatures, footprints from Asia, and the areas that were highlighted, which were refugia for the tiger, were exactly those areas associated with these Sasquatch-like tracks. Now, not that there's a direct correlation between tigers and Sasquatch, but rather they both have similar habitat needs. And so these wet, closed forests were, where human development and fragmentation has not completely impacted them, were consistently distributed. And one of those examples was the Josh Gates footprints. So that was interesting in itself, in that it further established this continuity of distribution, because this is where Sasquatch of North America must have originated, was in Asia. 75% of the mammals that we think of as common to North America, as native to North America, actually arose in Asia and came across the land bridge at various times. And Sasquatch, I think, was no different. I think that's where it came from. So we should expect to find comparable relic populations in the fragmented habitats of Asia.
One of the things I find most interesting about when we start talking about Bigfoot and Bigfoot type creatures is how many places around the globe have sightings of a similar type creature. Have you had a chance to examine, like, for example, Yowie or Alma or Owl Mouse tracks?
Yes, in some cases I have. I have not had the opportunity to go to Australia. That's on my bucket list. Australia is a funny wild card because it, for all the anecdote and history, the foot record is just all over the board. You have 3-toed, 4-toed, 5-toed. You have 18-inch tracks. You have 5-inch tracks. I mean, not growth series, different shapes, different sizes, proportions. There's virtually almost no two, except for the hoaxes. And there are blatant hoaxes that have taken place, and unfortunately are extremely distracting. But by comparison to the case to be made for the Sasquatch, it's just non-existent footprint evidence. I have had a chance to see some of the Almasti footprints, especially those in Mary Jean Kaufman's collection. And that's interesting because they are distinct from the Sasquatch tracks. I mean, they're certainly not of the size. They're more human sized. They do have an arch. They are a arched foot that is very broad, very robust. They resemble fossilized footprints that we attribute to the Neanderthal, which is very human-like but very broad. I mean, the Neanderthal has a very robust skeleton and heavily muscled body compared to humans.
Mm.
And
Uh-oh. Rose up here for a second. Is it just me, or is
and then there's
you froze up for a second, Dr. Meldrum?
Yep.
We've got you back now, but you froze up there for a second.
Oh, did I? Okay. Do I need to jump off and jump back on again?
No, I think
No,
I
you're
think it's
good
okay
now.
now, but we can for about 10 seconds.
All right. Should I repeat some of that, or
It's the
Yes.
government. Government docs. They're
government,
doing it. They're doing
trying
it.
to suppress the information, right?
That's it.
So we mentioned the Yowie, we mentioned the Sasquatch, we talked about the Yeti, the Almas, and then the other one is are the little people of Southeast Asia, that may be able to be connected to Homo floresiensis. In fact, I just have right over here Dr. Gregory Forth, University of Alberta, just published a book about the search for a living hominoid or hominid, and it makes the case for the possible persistence of something like Homo floresiensis that is at the root of the reports of little hairy hominins in Southeast Asia. And
Now, is that considered the rock ape? Is that like the rock ape in Vietnam? Or
it could well be. There are reports of the little people on the mainland, the Malay Peninsula, and presumably up as far. But most of my encounters with vets who talk about the rock apes as more than just urban legends or suburban legends. But, they seem to describe something that's much larger. Like on the order of a grade 8 or a giant, like a Sasquatch-like creature. So it's still a little ambiguous. There are these cases where it's very tempting, and I tend to try to pigeonhole and impose some, and I hope it's not selectivity, but some systematic organization to the evidence, because if it is consistent, and we can consistently pigeonhole into a certain number of discrete species, that makes a much more credible case than just this hodgepodge of anything goes. And so, but there have been some reports from Southeast Asia that are kind of hard to know. Like Cliff has drawn attention through his study of the orang pendek. There's this orangutan, I think it is, if I'm saying it right. But it's bigger. It doesn't really sound like it's maybe a Sasquatch sized. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's, instead of a giant ape, maybe it's a relic hominoid or hominin, like Homo erectus. I mean, we know there were Homo erectus on Java potentially as recently as 25,000 years ago. Some have contested that date as being too young, that it was more like 75,000 years ago. But even that, I mean, it's just like with Homo floresiensis, went from 13,000 to 50,000 for the youngest skeleton. But I mean, even that's just a snap of the fingers. And so, so I don't know. I mean, maybe we need more bins than just the 4 or 5. And this is what's interesting. I mean, again, early on in my career, I was kind of reluctant to even acknowledge, let alone discuss and debate the evidence for things other than Sasquatch. I mean, you're trying to make a case for this one hominoid, and one bad enough, but to have 4 or 5. But now the backdrop rather, has changed. We now have this concept of this family tree that's bushy as all get out, and that there are potentially many lineages on that bush that may have persisted alongside us, alongside our own species. And so, that
you have to be careful
norm.
what you do. Being a scientist, you do, just like what did to what's her name, did the DNA. Right.
Yeah,
I mean, I believe I mean, you got critics out there, skeptics and everything, and it's crazy. I think it's going to take a body to make people realize that this thing is real.
Well, that would certainly do the trick. That would do the trick. I mean, ultimately, that's the traditional requirement, the traditional standard of evidence that has to be met. There is a lot of discussion in the literature that in the case for rare and endangered species, that a body might not be necessary, that a voucher specimen of DNA could do the trick. And that hasn't been done. That hasn't been recognized. So Sasquatch could be a good test case for that attitude. If we could get DNA that shows clearly and independently corroborated that there's a species, a primate, a non-human primate species from a sample here in North America, what else could it be?
Exactly. I mean, by you seeing the footprints. I mean, you seeing the footprints, and that's what your background is, and you're in that, and dermal ridges and everything. What else could it be?
Well, exactly. I mean, when people ask me, what do you think is the most compelling evidence?
Right.
Evidence. That's it. And it's partly a bias because, as you point out, I can appreciate that evidence perhaps more than than some people can. And but you know, the skeptics tend to fall back on this adage. I think it's attributable to Carl Sagan, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidences, and we can argue the merits of that statement if that debate that, but as far as I'm concerned, there should be the same standard of evidence regardless. Just your own preconception of what's extraordinary versus ordinary shouldn't bias your interpretation of the analysis carried out on evidence if it's done authoritatively and credibly. So,
well, it's like Steve is a nurse. So when Steve draws anything like that and he's got to have that proof right there. Right. Just like you do with the footprints. I mean, and like I didn't believe in this at all until I had my sighting. So it was like it opened my eyes up even more. What I seen. Wasn't a guy in a monkey suit, wasn't a Z. And it changed me because I don't even go hunting anymore.
Yeah.
You don't, my background, DA knows my background. Steve has an idea. I'm not one to scare easily.
Right.
But no, going out there with some and I know what's around me. And that to me woke me up.
Sure. Well, yeah. And I've talked to a lot of people who have had a very similar reaction to that, whether it's just the extraordinary implications of what they've seen and that impact, or if there might even be something that happened on a visceral level. This term being zapped has become popular, but I had suggested in my book very early on, based on some conversations with one of the bioacoustics scientists that we featured in the book, that these creatures could be producing infrasound. We talked about
like a tiger.
Yeah. Well, the list just goes on and on of the animals that utilize infrasound. But you're right, a tiger can use it as part of their predatory roar, which actually causes a physiologic response in the prey and can disorient, can stymie them. And if a creature is able to produce this infrasound, which they can presumably do without an audible cry overlaying upon it, so you don't hear any vocalization, but you feel the response. And there's been lots of studies that have shown. I mean, this is why the military, and I was told recently, I said it in past tense, the military had experimented past tense.
No, they have it.
Trying to weapon. Well, yeah, exactly. And then someone says, "Oh,
they have it."
Past tense, they have it. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
But so they have found that there are receptors in your brain, emotion,
that just
your
shut off.
The brain, right? That are designed to be stimulated by a neurochemical, but they're also sensitive to particular frequencies of sound. And so when subjected to some of these infrasonic frequencies that you can't hear, it can trigger, and that's where this, some people or some frequencies elicit the euphoric sensations, and other frequencies may elicit this dread. Because I would wonder, like yourself, why would a macho outdoorsman suddenly become completely unwilling to go out anymore? And if they do, they always are armed. They'll never go hunt in that place again, though. What is it that about?
Teeth when I trust me.
Yeah, and I think that's a real possibility. I mean, great apes have the plumbing. They have the extralaryngeal air sacs.
Right.
Humans rarely do, but sometimes we get them atavistically. Chimpanzees.
I didn't know that. Okay.
They're most developed in the Asian apes, or in the orangutan, which is interesting because if Bigfoot has its closest affinities to the orangutan, then it very likely.
Right.
And so infrasound may very, very possibly be part of their behavioral repertoire.
From an
could be right about
evidentiary
that.
standpoint, from an evidentiary standpoint, Dr. Meldrum, you touched on something regarding Carl Sagan's quote. The extraordinary claims to extraordinary proof, and you basically kind of posited the contrapositive of that why should we have to require any more extensive proof than anything else? It's it adds an inherent bias in. It is interesting that you mentioned that, because as a biologist, I read all the time about these new species being discovered, and a lot of times this determination of these species is reliant on observations, photographs. They're not shooting these exotic birds that I may have found the only one in the world. It does kind of take away some of the expectation that for us to believe in Sasquatch, we have to see the body. And,
Right, exactly.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, I remember thumbing through a field guide to dolphins, porpoises, and whales, and there were several species that were depicted with drawings, colored drawings, because there were no known photographs of these specimens, and no physical specimen had ever been collected. And I thought, well, that's a double standard, isn't it? But yeah, and that's why one of the reasons too that I've again, early on in my work, I was always reluctant to put too many eggs in the Patterson-Gimlin film basket.
Oh.
I just thought we shouldn't dote over that one piece of evidence to extent. And I'm of a different mindset now, because I think that is such compelling evidence, and it was such not unique, but such an exceptional circumstance, an opportunity realized by those two men, that it needs to have the full impact. And I tell you, the more I study that, the more impressed I am. I mean, I can't be more convinced. I'm as convinced as you can be, short of having stood there and watched the whole thing unfold in front of me. But with each further examination, I'm more impressed by the fact that it anticipated in so many ways aspects of our understanding of hominin evolution, by decades, and got it right, not just once or twice, but a dozen different anatomical correlates that I can point out that in 1967 were considered contradictory to conventional wisdom, that cut against the grain, and provided the basis for rejection. My favorite, real quickly, my favorite Napier, John Napier, who actually viewed the film as part of the Smithsonian panel. He was obviously impressed enough by it and by other evidence that he wrote a book in the sunset of his career on the Bigfoot and Yeti question. And when it came to Patterson-Gimlin film, he sort of stuck by his initial reaction, which was negative. But he said, the only thing I can really put my finger on is that when I look at that from the waist down, it looks essentially human, but from the waist up, it looks like an ape. And he said, I can't imagine such a chimera, such a mosaic of characteristics being combined naturally in nature. So it must be a contrivance. It must be a hoax. Well, isn't it interesting? His book came out in the early 70s, 72, I think it was. By about 75, 76, the skeletal remains of Lucy and her ilk were better understood, discovered and better understood. And how did they describe her to the popular press? Isn't this interesting? From the waist down, she looks like a little human, but from the waist up, she looks like a chimpanzee. The exact description that Napier used for what was on the film. But of course, for him, that was the deal breaker. But now, a decade later, that's exactly how we envision early hominins to exhibit this unusual combination of the lack of development of the brain yet, the heavy chewing apparatus, the heavy musculature, but long legs of a bipedal adaptation. So, I mean, and I can go from the head down to the feet and point after point after point that anticipated what we now understand. Now, how could Roger or anyone, even if Roger had a coach in the back, the background, no one at that time that was, clued into the mainstream anthropology would ever advise him to incorporate those kind of contradictory characteristics, at the time contradictory, but yet turn out to be exactly on the spot. It just, I mean, it just gets me wound up, because there's, I get so aggravated when people offhandedly dismiss that, oh, that's just a man in a fursuit. I mean, just the suit question itself is a whole lecture, but all of these other anatomical features that are usually not even visible in most off-the-shelf suits that were available in 1967 just scream for attention.
Well, he didn't have the advantage of computer rendering or 3D printing or anything like that. I mean, assuming that he had the data, he wouldn't have had the technology to effectively harness that data.
Look at Planet of the Apes. He got the same year, and the costume was nothing compared to it.
I mean, my personal amazement is the fact that he saw this thing walking down the creek bed and he took off after it.
Yeah.
I mean, way was grande, sir, because I would have gone the other direction with or without my horse. There's no way.
Well, I think he had walked through that scenario in his mind time and time again. I really do. I mean, he certainly is to be commended for that presence of mind to execute that maneuver. But yeah, and that's an interesting aspect. I never had the opportunity to talk with him, but hearing Bob Gimlin relate his experience, and in casual settings, informal settings, just his reaction and his observations about what he saw, and the realization of the implication, his sort of ambivalence prior, curiosity but ambivalence, So anyway,
I've seen examples in both photographic evidence and casted material with 3, 4, and 5 toes. Any explanation on what could that possibly be?
yes. In most cases, my experience has been that the odd numbers of toes involve imprints that aren't even footprints. They're artifacts. They're just they resemble a footprint. In the case of 4 toes, I mean, there's always the chance of an amputation. I mean, obviously these creatures are out in harsh environments and extremes of weather and temperature and so forth. And
lose one to frostbite or something like that.
Sure, yeah, something like that. Or again, since, as we were discussing at the onset, some of the mechanics of the footprints and the foot function, since the toes aren't using the toes for push off, there are instances where the toes, if considerable traction isn't required, just because of they're walking on the flat or whatever, the push off comes from the forefoot. And I have examples, the tracks that I witnessed in '96. I've got a couple of examples that at first glance you might think that they were 3-toed because it looks like the 4th and 5th are missing altogether. Excuse me. Of course, there are subsequent examples where the toes have dug in and they're deeply impressed, and they're obviously all 5 there. But in some cases, the 4th and 5th have not pressed in as deeply and not left a very distinctive impression. So that's another possibility as well. So but otherwise, I think that as far as there being, and I shouldn't say never. Again, you never say never. But for those who would suggest that there's a subpopulation of inbred Sasquatch that have only 4 toes or 3 toes or whatever, it's I don't think that's justified. So
I saw one example of a 3-toed track that was taken somewhere in Louisiana, and it turned out to be a very large alligator.
right. I mean, there's the whole tradition of the Honey Island monster, and that's been repeatedly demonstrated that he had alligator footprints that were used to hoax. I've had conversations with his daughter about that and so forth, and it is what it is. It's just a historical feature now.
Dr. Meldrum, I really appreciate you coming on tonight. I know we've passed the 2-hour mark, which is usually where we start wrapping things up. I
Yep.
can't thank you enough for coming on the show. You have just been an absolute wealth of information. I've been a huge fan of seeing all of your stuff on History Channel and some of the documentaries. I've got your books. I really appreciate you coming on. It has been a wonderful evening. I apologize we weren't able to get to everybody's questions tonight. We only have so much time, and I would love to have you back on at some point in the future if you'd be agreeable to that, so we could
Sure.
continue this conversation. But it has been a fantastic conversation. I thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule, because I know you're a very busy guy, and
Yeah, sure.
you
Well,
spending.
I hope it's been enlightening and maybe shed some new light. Yeah, thank you for the great questions, and it was fun to explore some different topics in slightly different ways this time. So appreciate that as well.
So we get you on. We get you back on again. We'll definitely have a whole host of more questions, I'm certain.
Okay.
Uh,
All right.
Again, thank you very much for joining us, sir. If anybody's unfamiliar with your work, hopefully they're lining up to start watching some of those documentaries. Legend Meets Science is such a great show, and all of the episodes of Monster Quest. My favorites are obviously the Snell Grove, the Snell Grove Lake.
Sure.
Those were really good. But
Well,
you
and
just
at the risk of appearing to self promote, I would really encourage, especially those that there's a new generation of people with interest in the book Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, not the TV documentary. They're quite distinct, but the book Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, which is available on Amazon or at paradisek.com. It's a great starting point for the conversation, not only my own opinions, but it brings in scientists from a variety of different disciplines. Also, I would just want to plug real quickly I mentioned earlier on the Relic Hominoid Inquiry. If you Google that, you'll find it very easily. Relic with a T, Relic Hominoid Inquiry. It's on the ISU server, so www.isu.edu/RHI. We're now in our 11th year, so there's 10 years worth of research articles, essays, lengthy, in-depth book reviews, news items, all sorts of translated works of foreign investigators that are only available on our publications. So it's a great resource to take advantage of, open access.
I'll definitely be digging into that too.
Good.
Again, thank you so much for coming on, sir. It has been a wealth of information. I appreciate everything you do, all of your hard work. You've really kind of opened the eyes of a lot of people in this generation to the possibility of the Sasquatch being there. Of course, you're always going to have those of us that are firmly believers that have had experiences of our own, but it's becoming more of a mainstream topic, and I'm really glad that it's been pioneers like you that have really done the work to bring this subject to light and to bring credibility to a subject where 30, 40 years ago, if you said you had a Bigfoot sighting, they immediately just thought you were crazy.
Right. Yeah, things have changed, haven't they? You bet. Well, thank you for the opportunity, and I'll look forward to a future opportunity as well.
Well, we will definitely want to have you back on, and again, we'll have a bunch more questions for you. So, thank you everybody for the questions. Thanks for the great chat tonight. Thanks for the super chats, and folks, if you enjoyed this, make sure you like, share, and subscribe, and share this video with people you know that enjoy this kind of content. And join the channel and help us continue to bring content like this. And hope you guys had a great night, and we will see you guys on Wednesday. Dr. Meldrum, thank you again. I hope you have a wonderful night and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Have a good night, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you for joining us. Catch us again Wednesdays and Saturdays on Dax Machina. A special thanks to all our channel members and Patreon supporters. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe.